Welcome to the Design Lecture Series. Today we have a special guest, Annika Hansteen-Izora, with us. They are the creative director at Somewhere Good, and they previously worked at Ethel's Club, an immersive wellness platform centering people of color, as well as with other clients such as Samsung, Intel, HP, and Jamila Woods. Annika, we're super excited to have you here today. And without further ado, please take it away.
All right, let me share my screen. Thank you all so much for being here. Also, this is a perfect way for me to start my Monday. So don't let the professional looking keynote get it confused. This is very much in the words of Prentice Hemphill, although I'm going to misquote them, but this presentation is going to be a lot more about questions and a lot less about answers. So I'd really love to unprofessionalize presentations. So we're just going to be working through this together and just asking a lot of questions together. So I'm just really excited to be here and to be exploring this topic that's really important to me with all of y'all. But throughout this, I'm gonna ask some cues and y'all can drop answers in the chat. And if you do that, that would make me so happy, would make my heart so full. But we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I am going to be talking about dreaming, which is a really important thing to me, not just as a Pisces, I feel like that's what we're known for, but just as a human in the world. And as a designer, I'm curious about how dreaming can be used as an act of speculative design. And I want to start off with a quote by Robin D.G. Kelley, who has an incredible book called Freedom Dreams that everybody needs to add to their ever-evolving book list. But the quote is, "We must tap the well of our own collective imaginations, that we do what earlier generations have done, dreaming." So again, my name is Annika Hansteen-Izora. I use all pronouns interchangeably. And I want to start off with the question of, where is home for you? If you can answer that in the chat, that would make me happy. I'm sharing my screen, so I actually cannot see the answers, but I feel like in collective energy, like all of us being here on this one digital portal space, we should go ahead and answer anyway. But my home is a few different places. I'm from Palo Alto, California, the suburbs of Sacramento, California. I lived in Portland, Oregon for 12 years, and my main family still lives there. Went to school at Oberlin College out in Oberlin, Ohio. And my current home is Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York. And I can see the little chat bubble at the top, and I can see the little number notification and that people are answering. I love that. I hope the spirit of all of your homes can be brought into this space today. But I do a lot of different things, like I'm sure all of you do as well. So there's me, and I'm a brand designer and a UI designer and an art director, a writer and a poet and a dreamer. And all of these work together for me to inform how I care about and how I move through the world. And like a lot of us, I also grew up on the internet. And for myself, I feel like the internet is a location in itself. It's a home in and of itself. And so it's an important space that really informs how I move through the world as well. And just to give y'all a little bit of background. So in the past, I was the head of creative and design for Ethel's Club, which is a social and wellness space and platform for people of color. I also was the creative director for Form No Form, which is an online 24/7 TV channel that shares films by directors and writers of color. I'm the co-runner of Black Feast, which is a culinary platform that creates works and creates meals and creates culinary experiences that are based off of Black artists' work. And I'm currently the head of design at Somewhere Good, which is a social media startup that's based on auditory conversations that is reimagining how the internet works on social spheres. And I feel like it's important to name a few things that I believe in as a designer before diving into things. So for myself, I believe design is a tool, first and foremost, for connecting dots and creating meaning. And from that, it's a method of challenging the status quo, which I'm going to go into a little deeper in the future. I believe that online worlds have the potential to create new tools and communities and spaces centered in learning and creation. And I believe in dreaming as an act of disruption. So let's start with, what do I mean by dreaming? So in the chat, could you name in this current moment what dreaming means to you? And I'm going to give a moment for that. Amazing. I see folks sharing answers. Thank you. I love the collection of meanings together. As folks are adding their own definitions of dreaming, I'm going to share my own. This is not to advocate for one meaning of dreaming, because I feel like anytime we're advocating for one meaning, it is not going to go in a good direction. This is just my own and a way that I understand dreaming. But for me, dreaming is a method of imagining alternative futures. And by alternative, I mean futures that move against the current of normalcy, or what is considered normal. And where alternativity is invested in transformation, normalcy is invested in domination. And I want to bring in this meme, which is one of my favorites, that was shared by Decolonize the Art World. And yeah, I think you are here. Yeah, you are here on the chat. But this is really, for me, or I guess dreaming is a meditation for me on how dreaming can be a method of working against colonial restrictions on our imagination. And I'm going to go a little bit into what that means for me. So if we think about a culture of normalcy, we can think about how what is considered normal is often defined through violence and subjugation by those that are in power. Those that are in power create the definition of what is normal and what is to be aspired to. And we live in a society that is invested in whiteness and capitalism and colonialism and ableism and patriarchy and many other forms of violence. And this investment means that certain modes of violence become normal. And what I mean by that is that on a daily basis, I see images and incidences of violence that are just now held as just being normal, everyday acts of living. I feel like this experience in the pandemic was showing multiple instances of how violence just became a part of everyday life in a way that it was just made into normalcy. Which is where dreaming comes in for me. And dreaming is about expanding our minds beyond the culture of white supremacy. And by a culture of white supremacy, I mean that white supremacy isn't just being racist. It's also a way that culture moves. White supremacy is a culture, which means that it holds values and ways of being that are invested in upholding white supremacy. And some of those values can look like perfectionism or hyper individuality or Russianness or passiveness. And if white supremacy is held as the normalcy, then those actions are seen as normal. And so dreaming then is asking us to see our connections to each other and to tend to and grow those connections to build structures outside of the tables that were never built with care in mind. And I want to bring up a quote here by Saidiya Hartman, which is on how so much of the work of oppression is policing the imagination. So when we think of imagination, this isn't something that is just like a very floaty concept. We're really living in a world that is spun from the imaginations of those in power. And when we're living in a world that's spun from the imaginations of those in power, then different modes of violence can occur and be seen as normal. So then what does dreaming mean for design specifically? So I'd love if folks could name what a designer is to you. And again, this isn't just to create one solid definition of a designer, because that just isn't useful and I feel like isn't the path to go down. Design can look like many different facets, and I feel like there are a collection of amazing people in the room and on the chat that have different ideas of what design mean. So if you can just name a few ways what a designer is to you, that would be amazing. Yay, I see the chat. Red notification bubble lighting up. Thank you for folks that are adding your answers. You are so appreciated. Okay, thank you for folks that added answers. So I feel like in the popular understanding of design, so in the popular wave of culture, design is often thought about in the sense of problem solving. And that can often look like solving problems that are aesthetically rooted. So designing a screen, designing a graphic, designing a table. Often design is talked about in terms of aesthetic problem solving. But although I can't see the answers in the chat, I'm sure y'all are sharing a myriad of ways that go against the concept that design is only aesthetic. When I think about the meaning of design, I think about how it originates from Latin designum, which means to mark out, or designo, which means I mark out, point out, and describe. And to me, a lot of the meanings of design are rooted in meaning creation, in extracting meaning. And so to me, design is something that creates our world, just as our world creates us. And I want to pull in a quote by Arturo Escobar, who notes that design is ontological in that it designs objects, tools, and services that bring about ways of being. So design to me is something that creates culture and that is also created by culture. So when I think about how design is a part of culture making, I think about speculative design. And speculative design was a phrase that was popularized by Anthony Doon and Fiona Raby. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing their names incorrectly there. But speculative design, in their understanding, is a design process that is concerned with future design proposals of a critical nature. And by critical, we can think of, again, moving against normalcy, moving design that really is moving in directions that are thinking of alternative futures. So in this quote, Anthony Doon and Fiona Raby are noting, let's call it critical design that questions the cultural, social, and ethical implications of emerging technologies, a form of design that can help us to define the most desirable futures and avoid the least desirable. So to me, in this sense, design can be a direct act of speculating about every space in our world. In thinking about the possibilities of design, we can look to different schools of thought, like Black speculative thought, Black feminism, Afro-Nowism, disability justice, queer and trans justice, and critical race theory about redesigning our world. So in this sense, design becomes a tool that we can speculate alternative futures, alternative tools, and alternative meanings. And again, I want to note this quote, which says, much of today's dreaming around technology is shaped by military priorities or a short-term market-led view of the world based on standardized consumer dreams and desires. So in this quote, Anthony Doon and Fiona Raby are talking about technology, but I also want to think of this quote in the context of design itself. I'm curious and critical of how many of the productions of design we see are shaped by, like it's being noted here, military priorities or consumer desires. So when we think about how design is producing culture, and we think about how culture is invested in white supremacy in many instances, we can see a lot of different instances where design is articulating white supremacy in a way. And I'm going to show a few different examples. So if we think about design within social media platforms, in this example, there's an article that's talking about how Facebook's algorithmic formula was prioritizing the angry emoji reaction on post, so that when an anger emoji was used, it was weighted in a way to get more attention. And so in this way, the platform was designed to tend attention to a certain kind of energy. And in a way was adding to, or not in a way, was adding to rage and misinformation. If we look at brutal architecture design, these are examples of design that was made as anti-homeless architecture that can be seen in various cities. But this is another example of a way that design is being used to create futures that are rooted in supremacy. We can think about the design of the TSA scanning. I'm going to call them booths in this moment, but we can think about the design of TSA scanning booths and how they scan and show different parts of the body as abnormalities for folks that are trans, and how this type of designs adds to anti-trans legislative. And I also want to bring up design that is inaccessible to read. I think about how gradients have become very ingrained in popular design, and how I feel like in the past summers, gradients became a big part of the design that we see in Instagram, infographics, for lack of a better word, and how many of these graphics have been critiqued for attempting to share information with masses of people, and yet they are inaccessible to read for a number of people. And so again, this is an instance where a certain kind of culture is being normalized. You can see it in the TikTok algorithm, how TikTok has been under fire multiple times for the design of its algorithm being seen as going against and hiding Black creators. And we can see it in the redesign of Facebook's facial recognition software, where there was There were articles put out about how Facebook was going to shut down its facial recognition software, and then Facebook, as we might know, rebranded into Meta, and information was put out about how Meta is going to continue the use of facial recognition technology. And so this is a way in which supremacy was just rebranded under the guise of a new social network. So I give all of these examples to say, as Langdon Winner said, artifacts have politics. So design is not something that is neutral. The products of design are things that have politics, are things that have meaning, and those meanings are entrenched in culture. I want to bring up a quote by Adrienne Marie Brown, and it's a bit long, but I still think it's important to note. She says, and this is from her work, Emergent Strategy, "We are in an imagination battle. Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Renisha McBride and so many others are dead because in some white imagination, they were dangerous. And that imagination is so respected that those who kill based on an imagined radicalized fear of Black people are rarely held accountable. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of ability. I often feel I'm trapped inside someone else's capability. I often feel I'm trapped inside someone else's imagination, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free." And I want to underscore a moment within this quote, which is that I must engage my own imagination in order to break free. And to me, that is the potential of dreaming. It's a method of breaking free, of questioning what is normal, what is normalcy, and asking for something more, asking for something more than beyond the violence that normalcy often hands. In design, there can be what are known as universal design principles. And I feel that dreaming can be an act of moving against universality. The problem and the danger of universal design principles is assuming that everyone can be under the same standards, that the same standards apply for everyone in the room. But something that I want to question is who creates what can be considered universal? Often I feel like that is relegated to those in power. And if those in power are the ones that are denoting what can be universal, then nothing good is going to form from that. And so I want to bring in a quote by Octavia Butler, who notes, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change." And so within that, dreaming becomes an aspect of change. Dreaming becomes a way in which change can be moved. I noted how design is not neutral, and I want to underscore that again, and how design is not divorced from the dominant power structures that they reside in. In fact, a lot of the time they feed one another, which is what I noted in the examples that were a little earlier. So if then design is a tool for creating meaning, my question is, can we invest in meanings that break the master's tools? And that is a quote, or excuse me, that is a phrase that is from Audre Lorde's "The master's tools will never break the master's house." Can we imagine past the homogeneity and passivity of normalcy? Can we engage in design without reliance on reinforcing dominant narratives? Can we dream more deeply and expansively? So I want to pause there and just know that in thinking about how we can dream in ways that are going beyond dominant narratives, what I'm very curious about is where we are learning about design and what design education looks like. In my practice of dreaming and in what dreaming can look like to me. Dreaming is a lot about imagination. And so I'm curious about what different schools of thought we can look to in stretching our imagination. One of those schools for me is Afro-Nowism, and Stephanie Dinkins has a beautiful definition of what Afro-Nowism is. And to her, Afro-Nowism is the spectacular technology of the unencumbered Black mind in action. It is a willful practice that imagines the world as one needs it to be able to support successful engagement in the here and now. Instead of waiting to reach the proverbial promised land, also known as a time in the future that may or may not manifest in your lifetime, Afro-Nowism is taking the leap and the risk to imagine and define oneself beyond systemic oppression. It is active resistance away from cynicism, disaffection, and indifference towards constructively channeling energy today. For Black people in particular, it means conceiving yourself in the space of free and expansive thought and acting from a critically integrated space, allowing for community sustaining work. So for me as a designer, I never went to design school. I learned design really all on, well, not on my own, because I was looking to all of these different teachers that I found in books and in album covers and online. But when I was learning to design, I was looking to different schools of thought that were teaching me different principles of what design can look like. And for me, Afro-Nowism stepped in as a way that I could think about how design could be a tool of active resistance. And if design is a way of creating meaning, I was curious of how design could be a part of creating meanings that were constructive and that were thinking about critical thought and critical new spaces that were needed. And so if we are to design from a space that's rooted in interdependence and transparency and connection and care, we must take a deeper look at the ways that power moves the imagination, and dreaming is a method of stretching the imagination. So if we're to think about the intersections of designing and dreaming, a few thoughts that I have are that design education must look to schools of thought that divest from WSCCAP, which is known as the white supremacist, capitalist, colonial, ableist patriarchy. And some schools of thought that I look to in how we can think of alternative futures and how we can speculate different understandings of design are Black feminist thought, our cultures of learning, our disability justice, algorithmic justice, queer and trans justice, Black speculative thought, and looking deeper into the politics of design. The other note is, if we wish to use dreaming as a method of speculative design, we must critique the romanticization of dreaming. And I want to pause here for a moment. Dreaming, I think, can often be thought about in this very floaty, romantic sense. And to me, dreaming isn't just thinking of joyous possibilities. That is a big part of it, I think. I think being able to think of really beautiful futures is an important aspect of design. But I don't just want to think about dreaming in this very floaty sense. If we're breaking normality down, that also means uncomfortable and hard work. And so dreaming isn't just meant to be this very like floaty way of thinking about things. It's also thinking really critically and moving towards uncomfortable spaces. I think it can be very easy to say like, okay, I'm going to think about how I can design a future that moves against normalcy. But many of us, including myself, all of us really are invested in normalcy in one way or another. And it can be very, very, very uncomfortable to divest from that method or from that school of thought. And so dreaming isn't just meant to be this very romantic thing. It's meant to be something that can spark actual, real actions. If we think about dreaming and we think about design, I'm curious about how we can move away from the idea of moving fast and breaking things, and instead stretching towards a culture of learning. And this is a chart that's from the Kindergarten Approach to Learning. I'm missing the author's name, but I can put that in the chat in a moment. But the Kindergarten Approach to Learning was essentially a way of thinking about how learning is something that is iterative, that is continually expanding and looping, and that also incorporates play, that incorporates collectively sharing and collectively reflecting, and how that all can move into imagining new understandings and new ways of learning about the world. To me, a culture of learning looks like a lot of different things. It can look like building trust and compassion. It can look like speculation and imagination. It can look like building creative ecosystems. And to me, a creative ecosystem is a collective space and a collective group of people that is working together to create artistic work and imaginative work and creative work. A culture of learning can look like engaging in study and critique. It can look like sharing communal resources. It can look like time for rest and play and pleasure. And I'm curious on how a culture of learning can be brought more deeply into our design, to not only think about the aesthetic of design, but to really think about the meanings that it portrays, because there's always something that's deeper within the aesthetic of something. There's always a meaning or an idea being communicated. The other note about design and dreaming is that we need all of us. And this is a graphic that was created by, oh, the name is being lost on me, y'all, but I'm going to quote that one in the chat as well. But this is a graphic that is essentially speaking to how there are many ways that people can show up in the world and work together to create futures that are rooted in equity and inclusion and liberation and justice and solidarity and resistance and interdependency. It's essentially speaking to how we need all of us and how all of us have very unique offerings that can be used to support the futures that we dream of. Designers also have a huge role within this space as people and as folks that are invested in creating meanings and in the act of creation itself. So I want to wrap up here with a few thoughts. There are a few spaces that I see as really investing in how design can be a tool for dreaming. And to me, it's because these spaces are thinking about alternative futures. So a couple of spaces are Arena, which is a very hard platform to design or to describe in a way, but I love Arena. It's essentially a space where people are coming together and sharing different clips of knowledge. It almost looks like Pinterest, but it's not quite Pinterest. It really seems to be a bunch of folks that are invested in learning, sharing different thoughts on what learning can look like. Arena is a very interesting design space just because of the design of the platform itself. I've seen some folks call it the quietest place on the internet. And what's interesting about the design of Arena itself is that it goes against the design of what a lot of other social network platforms look like. It moves a lot quieter. There aren't really like or comment type features. There isn't some kind of algorithmic feed that's showing one type of content higher than the other. So just in the design of Arena itself, there are really interesting questions and really interesting possibilities. The School for Poetic Computation is a really incredible experimental artist-run school that's in New York, and they have many different classes and theories and research about the possibilities of art and technology. And they're really thinking in really beautiful and critical ways about the possibilities of design and technology. This logo in the middle that has the cloud was a project of Bufu, which is a collective called By Us For Us. And they hosted Collective Love on Your Desktop, which was essentially an experimentative school in which different people came together to teach different classes, all of which were rooted in speculating new futures and how we can pull those futures into the present. Bandcamp is a music platform that I feel like is one of, I'm sure there are many, but it's one of the main ones that I know that are really thinking about how artists can get paid for their work, which goes directly against the design of platforms like Spotify or Tidal or Apple Music. And Somewhere Good, which is where I work, but we're thinking about how we can design social platforms as well in a way that goes against the flow, the fast-paced flow of what other social platforms look like. So there are a few questions that I want to leave y'all with. And as a designer, I'm curious about your answers to these questions. These are questions that I return to in my design practice, and I'm continually refreshing the answer because change is always coming. But a few of those ideas are, what ideas am I holding on to that are invested in a culture of no malice? Who are my teachers in art and education? What is important to me? And what is my dream for the future individually and collectively? I feel like it is important to dream beyond the everyday, to really think about the possibilities for the future, and then to think about actions, tangible actions that can happen to pull those futures into the present moment. To me, that really looks like small actions, which can end up having a very large effect. But I think it's in our best interest to really continually think about different possibilities for the future and what that can look like in our own work. And as a designer, that's something that I'm curious about in the meanings that I'm constructing from my design, how my design can actually be a part of pulling the futures that I'm dreaming of into the present moment. And with that, I am going to stop talking because I would love to hear some of y'all's thoughts and questions. Again, this was very much a talk in thinking about questions rather than really rooting in answers. But I really appreciate y'all for being a part and for listening as I talked about dreaming. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annika. You've definitely left us with a lot to reflect on, a lot of questions to think about, and yeah. So if anybody has any questions, you can comment in the chat, or if you're in here in person, you can come up here and speak into the mic. You can share your questions with everybody. So Han in the chat says, do you keep records of your dreams?
Yeah, I keep a record of both just my dreams when I go to sleep, which, can be hard for me to hold on to as a practice, but I keep a record of those ones. And then in my journals, I'm often coming back to the questions of what dreams do I have for myself, but also the collective. So that's something that I try and answer at least every 6 months. It helps me not just kind of get lost to the day-to-day treadmill of things, but it helps me root myself and really remembering what it is that I care about and what it is that I'm really hoping to stretch myself towards. So dreaming practices are part of my everyday, and so keeping those records is fun. Yeah, it's actually very fun to look at them like from a very long time ago. I think I started when I was like 16. So it's very fun to look back on my dreams from like 10 years ago and see where they are now and how they've changed. But I suggest dreaming writing for anybody.
Right. Thank you. So Lizzie says, thank you for your lovely talk, Annika. What is the piece of advice you would give to young designers? Is there something you wish you had known sooner?
I feel like putting all of my work out there, including the ideas that I really didn't think anybody would be into, because that's not even the important part. The important part was if it interested me. I feel like when I was first starting out, especially as somebody that didn't go to design school and at the time felt self-conscious about that, I wasn't putting out a lot of my experiments. I was always like running towards perfection and was like, okay, if it's not perfect or if it's not client work, I can't put it out in the world. But my main piece of advice would just be to make things just because you think they're fun and just put them out for you to see. I think that's just a practice and really taking your craft seriously. And putting it out there can look like so many different facets. It doesn't have to just look like Instagram. It can be a website you can create. It can be an arena board. It can be so many different methods. But I feel like putting my work out earlier and the work, just doing some of the things that I thought were fun, would be something that I wish I knew sooner.
All right. Yeah, and the chat asks, what texts, written or otherwise, have significantly informed your design education?
That is a very good question. I'm thinking because usually when folks ask me like, what books, what texts, like every name of everything always just like runs outside of my head. I feel like for myself, articles have been like a really important point in where I've learned about design. Design thinking is a re-articulation of white supremacy is a really important article for me. And if I think about my actual design education, album covers, honestly, I don't know if that counts, but that was a huge one in informing how I design. But I suppose that's more in the aesthetic side of things. Okay, album covers count. Yeah, album covers were the very first way that I learned how to design. I just learned through replication. I would see an album cover and I would think, how can I do everything that the album cover did? Couldn't do any of the things with like illustration and stuff, although I kind of filled that in with stick figures or my own imaginings. But that was a really huge part. A lot of works that are in Black speculative thought, or what can also be known as Afrofuturism, although I prefer not to use that term. But I think a lot of works underneath that school of thought have been really important to how I design, just because those works were an example to me in what meaning making can look like and how you can make meaning that is invested in an alternative future. That was really important to me in my design education. Thank you for these questions also, y'all.
Hello, I'm in person, but thank you for your talk today. I was going to ask what your favorite album covers were. Like, do you have a top 3 or a top 5, or which ones were the most influential for your development?
That is such a good question. Parliament and Funkadelic's album covers were really huge for me. Just because of how like bright and bold they were. Funkadelics, like especially, I really have never liked, like, I've always moved towards color, like always moved towards really maximal, bold imagery. Minimalism never really spoke to me. And I think that was because of album covers like Parliament and Funkadelic. I also love Flying Lotus's album covers. I'm forgetting the name of his latest album, but every single little part of that album cover is telling a different story. And it was really incredible to see when he paired his album cover with motion graphics so that he could make different parts of the album cover move. And so when the album was put out, every single song had its own little animation in a way that went along with it. And I thought that was really incredible in how every single part of that album cover had a different story. And that album cover was based off of Prince's album cover. And I cannot remember the name of it, but there is a Prince album cover that is doing a similar thing. Like every little part of it is telling a different story. I feel like album covers is like this amazing opportunity for artists to tuck in this like sneaky little messaging about themselves, and Flying Lotus is someone that definitely is doing that in his work. So yeah, Parliament and Funkadelic, Flying Lotus. I'm missing a third. I'm going to say Minnie Riperton's, the one where has the blue background, just because that was such a like capture of her world to me. And it was just so beautifully done, and also just uses color in this incredible way. So those are my top 3.
Awesome. So we have another question in the chat. Very excited to read your book. How do you feel your experiences with queerness and tenderness shape your dreaming and your design?
That's such a good question. Oh my gosh. For those that don't know, I have a book coming out about tenderness and about thinking about different definitions of what tenderness can look like. I'm actually going to think about your question for a moment instead of pretending I have an answer right off bat, because I feel like that's a stressful thing that just happens in presentations that I'm actually not going to feed into. So let me think about it for a second. Something that I talk about in the book is, for me, how tenderness is really this action of showing compassion to all parts of myself. I feel like a lot of the time tenderness is posed as this antithesis to anger or any other kind of emotions that are just like held as bad emotions to have. But tenderness to me is about actions that are really compassionately holding all parts of myself. And to me, that works right alongside with my queerness. To me, my queerness just means that I can exist in all infinite and expansive ways, that I can exist in ways that supremacy will never be able to understand, that could never even begin to articulate an understanding of me. And so tenderness and queerness both work together for me in really holding all of the expansion of myself in a way that is compassionate. And dreaming then is also a tool for me in thinking about futures where everything is possible. So that then just kind of moves through design for me as really being able to have a method of pushing myself to see all possibilities. And that's like a pretty floaty thing to say, right? But I really mean that in a sense of helping myself move outside of my own constraints of what a design solution can look like, of really pushing myself to think about different concepts and different ideas that might be uncomfortable or might not make sense. So all of those are always just like working together to push me towards a space where I can imagine many things are possible, because I think the culture of supremacy wants us to believe that nothing beyond what is handed to us is possible. I think that is a really big lesson that abolition teaches, is that there are possibilities that can be pulled into fruition beyond what is just handed to us. So I can't answer your question in a way that's like very like perfectly done up in a bow, although I know that's not what you're asking in this question. But to me, it's like this very watery and weighty thing, where all of them are just pushing me towards being compassionate towards myself, and always knowing that there are different possibilities that I can be moving towards. Thank you for that question. Also, that was very beautiful, and I feel like I want to write it down so that I can continually reflect on it.
Hello, I just have one more question. You said earlier that like you call yourself a poet as well, so I'm wondering how you bring poetry into kind of your more commercial work, say like with Somewhere Good, or say with just previous work you've done. How do you see that influencing that type of work?
That's a great question. Thank you. I feel like poetry is also this practice of making meaning, or I guess finding meaning in things, in experiences that happen. So in that, to me, poetry is really incredible, where every part of it is intentional. Like every period, every comma, every line break in a poem, there's an intention behind it, and there's an intention in why it was structured that way. And I think about that with my design as well. I really want to think about how all parts of the design can be made with intention and can be made with meaning. So for when I think about my work with Somewhere Good, something that people point to a lot is how bold the colors are, how it's a very vibrant kind of design. And for me, I purposefully designed it to have this kind of mishmash, maxless look, because to me, a lot of social media startups, or let me not even say startups, a lot of social media brands look the exact way. I think something that frustrates me about the design of social media nowadays is it's not very fun. And you know, to me, fun social media design was when we had Club Penguin and Neopets and all of these other different platforms that weren't so investing in the same. So the design of Somewhere Good, I created that with the intention of it having meaning in really boldly proclaiming itself. So for me, poetry really teaches me about making sure that everything is done with intention, not just for the purpose of aesthetics. So that is something that I really hold as important in my design work as well. Yeah, I really love that. For those that can't see, they said aligned with this, poetry is from the Greek poem, make. So poets are also designers, but with words. I love that. Absolutely. I feel that's a very perfect word to end on, honestly.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for your questions, and Annika for your talk. We're out of time for today, but if anybody has any further questions, you can feel free to reach out to Annika on her social media, on Instagram. And thank you all for taking the time to come today.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you being here. Have a good night.